Welcome today, October 17th, to the 5th of the Bicentennial Lectures that have been exploring economic impact through the history of Morgan County. This is our Morgan County Bicentennial, 1820 to 2020. And these have been very exciting lectures. I'd like to thank the various folks who have sponsored all of our bicentennial celebration. The Morgan County Commission, Travel Berkeley Springs, the Two Rivers Giving Circle, the Foundation for Arts, Science, and Technology, the Museum of the Berkeley Springs, C&B Bank, and West Virginia Humanities Council. One of the exciting things today, after the lecture, is that we have commemorative coins, bicentennial commemorative coins. Really gorgeous coins. There are only 250 of them. They're all numbered, and we have some on sale today. They're $20, and Lori will be in the back selling them. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Jean Mosier. I'm one of the bicentennial team members, along with Stephanie Alamang and Lori Hansworth. And we've been doing bicentennial fun stuff all year. And I'm thinking we may continue it. I'm thinking we got another 100 years to go before we have to do anything else. Hopefully, so far we have done lectures on tomato canning, on tanneries, on the railroad, on the Civil War, and this will be our 5th one on sand mining. Tomorrow we will be releasing the video of last month's lecture, which was the railroads. Very exciting. Anybody who needs a mask, we're glad to see some live audience here. Please, they're available in the back of the room. And I do want to give a special thanks to Church of Christ, to Pastor Josh Hedrick, to the parishioners here for allowing us to use this wonderful facility, their state-of-the-art live streaming setup that is being personed today by Elizabeth Hedrick. And thank you very much, Elizabeth, for being willing to do this. It's been just perfect to have this venue. So, with no further ado, let me introduce, I forgot, our videographer, Bob Peak. You already heard about Lori, and so let me introduce our speaker today. And it was very exciting when I was laying out what lectures I thought needed to be given, and thought, I'm going to see if George Didawick will do the one on the sand mine. And he's been so diligent unearthing all this history. I think you all will find it exceptional. George is a native Morgan Countyan. He graduated from WVU as an industrial engineer, and he retired from the sand mine as its vice president of operations. So we feel confident that he knows what he's talking about.
When I joined the company here in Berkeley Springs back in the mid-70s, a friend of mine, a lifelong friend, Jeff Yost, was also employed there. Jeff called me one night and said, George, would you go with me to the Berkeley Club Bottling Company? He said, Ralph is going to retire and sell it. And I said, sure, Jeff, we'll go up and take a look at it. So we toured it, went through the building, went down to Ralph's house, which is now the Trump & Trump law offices. And Ralph explained the process and all the patents and so forth. And while we were there, he related the story about this funny little bottle, which I will talk about when I'm done with the presentation. Anyway, when we got done, Jeff and I met in the parking lot, was talking over the afternoon's events, and Jeff says, well, what do you think, George? And I said, well, truthfully, Jeff, I said, the building is old. The equipment is really kind of run down and seen its better life, and there's not enough space. And I said, besides that, the big guys, the Pepsis and the Coca-Colas, are kicking their butt here in its local community. And Jeff said, oh, I'm not really interested in bottling soda water and so forth. He says, I want to bottle water. And I looked at Jeff and I said, who in the world would buy a bottle of water? Shows you what I know, huh? Hey, West Virginia is the mountain state. WVU athletes are known as the Mountaineers. You can't go to a ball game without hearing John Denver's Country Roads. There's little doubt, or can be little doubt, that the mountains have had a tremendous impact on the minds and hearts of West Virginians. Mountains, including what lies beneath, have also impacted settlement history, land use, as well as economic and cultural development. This is also true for Morgan County and its history of silica sand mining, directly influenced by and made uniquely possible due to its geology. So for a few minutes, I'd like to go back and look at the geology. Warm Spring Ridge, sometimes referred to as Sandy Ridge, runs the entire length of Morgan County. Exposed on the east side of the ridge is the Oriskany Sandstone Formation, which begins near Oriskany, New York, and extends into Virginia. In Morgan County, the sandstone dips to the east at a 50 to 60 degree angle, and measured on a horizontal is about 200 feet thick. On the west side of this ridge, and running with the sandstone, is a huge formation of limestone. Separating the two is some alluvial material. The sandstone is white to brown. It's a silicon dioxide that is loosely cemented together, and the geologists call it a calcareous sandstone. During the Paleozoic era, the state and the surrounding areas was one giant inland sea. Collisions and separations of the continental plates caused the uplifting of mountains and the periodic subsidence of the sea. These cycles, along with the drastic climatic changes that were going on, provided sediments, which ultimately became layers of limestones, sandstones, and shales. These continental plate collisions near the end of the Paleozoic compressed these flat-lying sediments into the island sea. Unbelievable heat and pressures were created when the strata was pushed from east to west, forming uplifted folds and replacing the giant seabed that once existed there. Erosion and weathering by the wind, sun, wind, and rain reduced these mountains only to be uplifted again about 30 to 50 million years ago. Although the glaciers of the Ice Age never touched Morgan County, they had an impact on this environmental erosion. The two sandstones of interest were deposited during the latter part of the Paleozoic era. The Tuscarora, with outcroppings near Great Cacapen, and more prominently displayed at Seneca Rocks down in Pendleton County, and the Oriskany, which was deposited early, nearly 400 million years ago during the Devonian period. The sand, deposited in thin cross-bedded layers, reveal many marine fossil molds. To understand the when and why the sandstone was first commercially mined, I'm going to do a brief history of Morgan County's economic development. In 1700, Virginia considered any land west of the mountains, Blue Ridge Mountains, wilderness. About that time, one Thomas Eads arrived in the county and lived in a cave about 3 miles from what is now Great Cacapen on the Cacapen River. That cave is now called, the rock formation is now called Eads Fort. There was a small settlement near Bunker Hill in 1727, Winchester in 1732. In 1776, Virginia established the town of Bath. Virginia also created two exceptionally large counties, Augusta to the south and Frederick to the north. Frederick was further divided to make Martinsburg, or make Berkeley County, Jefferson County, and Morgan County in 1820. While Morgan County became a destination for use of the mineral springs, the rich bottomland of the county was a prized possession and cultivated early by immigrant farmers. Most of the virgin forests were timbered using primitive water-powered sawmills. In 1870, Lewis Shipley put the first steam sawmill into operation near Cherry Run. The chestnut oak, once abundant on all the dry mountain ridges, was timbered and the bark stripped off for local tanneries at Berkeley Springs and Paw Paw. A great number of young trees were cut for mine props, cross ties, poles, firewood. Forest fires were an ongoing issue. And by the turn of the century, there was little, if any, virgin forest remaining in the county. But the deforested hillsides of the county were quickly adapted to fruit growing, and farmers planted orchards of peaches and apples. And then that was followed by the planting of tomatoes, and various canneries followed suit. The economic development of the county was greatly accelerated with the completion of the National Highway in 1818 and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1852. Even though it was a period of great road building, the C&O Canal over in Hancock was completed in 1850. The Berkeley Springs and Potomac Railroad construction was completed in 1888. Electrical power was made available in the county, and even the castle had electrical lights in 1895. In 1893, H.H. Hunter displayed a sample of the sand at the Chicago World's Fair. It won a blue ribbon for its purity. The important thing about that, it gave exposure of the Oriskany sandstone here in Morgan County to the glass industry. The infrastructure had been built, a quality natural resource identified and nationally recognized, while the modernization of the plate glass and glass container industry soon created significant demand for the commercial mining of the pure Oriskany sandstone. Several publications indicate the earliest commercial sand mining in the county occurred near the end of the American Civil War. To move or load the sandstone, it had to be man-sized. Manually sizing those stones with dynamite, pickaxes, sledgehammers yielded the fine sand required for the railroads for traction sand, local masonry requirements, and other uses. Although the work required was physical, demanding, and dangerous, it evidently attracted men that had been working in the local tannery, as that business was on a decline and would soon become non-existent. From the initial early beginnings and into the early 1900s, multiple companies began mining and processing sand along Warm Springs Ridge. Primitive buildings were constructed of wood with multiple sections added as needed. Manually loaded mule-pulled carts transported the sand from the mine to the plant. These plants used 2 or 3 stages of crushing to reduce the sandstone to grains of sand. This would later prove to be a competitive disadvantage over the other more distant sand deposits that were unconsolidated. Washing of the sand was completed with screw classifiers or log washers, while the drying was accomplished with rotary dryers or coal-fired steam dryers. The following list of plants, starting at the Potomac River and given in the order of their location moving towards Berkeley Springs, existed after the turn of the century and is more fully described in the Volume 4 of the West Virginia Geological Survey reports dated 1916. Hancock White Sand Company. The Hancock White Sand Company, which was started by N.Q. Spear, was 1 mile west of the Hancock Station near the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The original plant began operating during the Civil War and was purchased by Pennsylvania Glass Sand and rebuilt in 1905. The plant consisted of 2 sections, with the first processing glass construction and engine sand, while the second contained 2 tube mills that used flint pebbles to produce finely ground sand used by the paint, scouring, and polishing powders. The sand and sandstone from the quarry were initially transported from the quarry by a mule-pulled cart, but later converted to the inclined narrow gauge rail system, which was pulled by a small locomotive, forerunner of the one currently displayed along the highway at the Berkeley Springs plant. A large spring at the base of the sandstone ridge furnished an abundant supply of water, which was quite pure. Capacity at the plant at that time was approximately 120 tons per 10-hour day. The remnants of the substantial frame and brick buildings and the spring remain today along the B&O railroad tracks. The quarry of the Hancock plant was at the top of the ridge, three quarters of a mile south of the mill and 280 feet above the railroad track. The Oriskany sandstone was exposed on the eastern slope, while on the upper western slope, a tunnel had been cut through the Heidelberg limestone to reach the sandstone. The outcroppings of sandstone were quite hard, and because of this, it was not quarried. Within the quarry, the rock was very friable and loose white sand readily available. Little blasting was required except for the purpose of loosening large portions of the rock wall. The large stones were easily broken by the sledge and manually shoveled into the cars. The quarry was initially worked by tunnels, but was later converted to an open pit cut. The Berkeley Springs plant was up the Branch Railroad some 4 miles from the Hancock Rail Station. Pennsylvania Glass Sand built its second plant there in 1904. The plant was rebuilt in 1919 and completely replaced with a much larger modern facility in 1929. A jaw crusher was used as the primary preliminary crushing of the sandstone. One mill contained a secondary crusher and 8 washing troughs, while the other had a secondary crusher and 7 troughs. The sand was dried in a long compartment heated by steam pipes with 7,000 feet of heating surface and a capacity of 10 tons per hour of dry sand. Storage bins were provided for 500 tons. Water for washing of the sand was originally pumped from the Potomac River, and the pipeline right-of-way is still listed on several maps. After water impoundments were installed, water was obtained from the Warm Springs Run. The daily capacity of this plant was 180 tons per day. The quarry opened in 1906 and was located about 975 feet from the mill. It was an open cut through the Marcellus and Hamilton shales, 250 feet long, if you can imagine, to go back into the quarry to start. The sand was loaded in 2.5-ton ore cars, passed down the incline track to the mill, and the empty cars were hauled back to the quarry by a small locomotive. West Virginia and Pennsylvania Sand Company. The owners of the West Virginia and Pennsylvania Sand Company were from Baltimore, Maryland. The company operated 3 adjoining plants, the West Virginia, Keystone, and Pittsburgh. There were also 2 quarries that supplied sandstone to the plants. The daily capacity of all 3 plants was estimated at 400 tons of sand. The West Virginia plant was 1/2 mile south of the Berkeley plant previously described. It contained 3 mills, each consisting of a wet pan, 5 washing conveyors, with the stone first crushed in a jaw crusher. The sand in the West Virginia plant was dried in a 28-foot-long rotary dryer. This plant produced 2 grades of sand. The Keystone plant, the smallest of the 3, was located a short distance from the first, but only had 1 mill. Pittsburgh plant. The Pittsburgh plant was located 3/4 of a mile south of the West Virginia plant. It was equipped with a blade crusher. It had 2 mills with a rotary dryer. The glass sand was stored in 2 vertical round steel tanks resting on concrete foundations and held 300 tons. The oldest quarry, located a short distance from the plants, was opened in the spring of 1900. In 1904, a new quarry was opened to the south, which had room for a dozen rail tracks. The floor of the quarry was 200 feet above the floor of the mill in parts of the quarry. Red clay seams occurred along the joint planes, which were 1 to 5 feet apart. The stone was worked under the ledges and then shot down in large masses. The sand was loaded into ore carts, which passed down the railroad track to the incline, or down the incline to the mill. National Silica Works. A pulverizing mill built in 1878 was located close to the town of Berkeley Springs and was formerly operated under the name of National Mining and Milling Company. In 1909, it was known as the National Silica Works and owned by Faust and Bechtel. It was equipped with a pebble mill 25 feet long and used to produce finely ground silica with little metal contamination. As no mines for this plant were identified, sand must have been purchased from others. Spear White. The Spear White Quarry Sand Company owned 5 acres of sandstone on the ridge and built a mill in 1905, 1/2 mile north of Berkeley Springs. The plant had a daily capacity of 140 tons, with the sandstone crushed in a jaw crusher and processed through a 9-foot wet pan. The sand was dried in a steam pipe heated dryer with 2 grades of sand being produced. Mr. N.Q. Spear, developer, had also built the Hancock plant, which he had sold his interest in years earlier. The Millard Sand Company. A sand plant was constructed in 1910 by E.F. Millard, a short distance north of the town of Berkeley Springs. The crushing plant was located on the ridge of the quarry, and the crushed sand was washed through a conveyor down the side of the ridge to the washing plant. The sand was then conveyed to the drying room and was dried by steam pipes and elevated to storage bins. The Berkeley Glass Works. The Berkeley Glass Sand Company was originally called the Bridges Company, or the Bridges Works. Robert Bridges was the founder and was, according to a Morgan County deed book dated May 12, 1868, mining sand on land across from William Crossfield. The sand processing plant officially opened in 1878 and was incorporated in 1892 with Bridges as president. In 1906, Bridges leased the operation to one Frank Ellen of Baltimore, but with Robert Bridges' death in 1908, his son, Henry P. Bridges, would eventually own and continue to operate the business. As a reference, here's the Berkeley Sand Works. Across from that is National Silica. This was Crossfield Planing Mill. And for those that might remember, this is the old North Berkeley School, which was a 2-story structure. Bridges lived in Baltimore, was a lawyer, and when he visited the local community, he would use this building as his office. It's at the end of Wilk Street, and to my knowledge, it's still there today. The quarry was located across the county road and nearly halfway up the ridge and had a face of rock 120 feet high. The sand was blasted, broken into small rocks, manually loaded into rail cars, and transported to the plant. The sand was crushed into large millstones and washed with water from Warm Springs Run. It was dried in 2 dryers 20 feet long. The capacity of this plant was 85 tons of number 1 sand and a like quantity of number 2 sand that was stained with iron. In June of 1926, a crew in this quarry was preparing explosives to blast a sandstone when a spark prematurely ignited the dynamite, killing 6 miners. John Unger, a local blind singer, was inspired by the miner's death and wrote a ballad called The Miner's Doom. Actually, 3 of them were killed instantaneously. 3 died later from their injuries. There was a crew of 15 working there that day, and 5 others were injured in that explosion. Made a dramatic impact on the sand mining industry at that point in time. The Peerless Glass Sand Company was started sometime after 1907 on land owned by John G. Faust. The land included several lots within the town of Bath and included an area referred to as the Hide Heap, a reference to the tannery that had been operating there. Although it operated into the 1920s, there are several circuit court cases wherein the company was charged with damage to homes and other mining-related issues. The last parcel of land from this operation was purchased in 1937 by PGS. In addition to the sand plants along the Warm Springs Ridge, there were 3 silica mines on the western slope of Kakapen Mountain near Great Kakapen. The Great Kakapen Silica Sand Company of Pittsburgh opened a quarry in 1904 on the west slope of Kakapen Mountain, 1.5 miles east of the Great Kakapen rail station. This plant only operated a short time and was removed. When opened, the owners had assumed the sandstone deposit to be the same as the one at Berkeley. But instead of being the Oriskany, the outcrop on this mountain was the White Medina, or locally referred to as the Tuscarora. The main mass of this sandstone, as exposed and processed in this quarry, was evidently not suitable for glass sand. Harbors and Walker Refractories. Property on Kakapen Mountain near the west of Great Kakapen contained outcroppings of the Tuscarora, which was leased early in 1916 by Harbors and Walker Refractories Company of Pittsburgh. The crude sandstone rock was loaded and shipped to their plant in Layton near Pittsburgh, where it was crushed and mixed with lime and made into silica brick. Their tests indicated the hard Tuscarora sandstone to be especially adapted to this product. The Hazel Atlas Glass Sand Company. The mine was started by N.Q. Spear around 1908 and eventually owned by Hazel Atlas Glass Company. The sandstone was mined from a vein of white sandstone behind Great Kakapen along a road that is now called Clay Pit Lane. From there it was transported by gravity railroad to a jaw crusher, which broke the rock into fist-sized stones. The rock then entered the Chilean mills with heavy manganese-covered millstones, crushed the small stones into individual grains of sand. After screening and washing, a log washer removed the impurities from the sand. It was sluiced down the mountainside to the drain shed where it was allowed to drain and then dried through steam dryers until it was dried. The sand was then moved by belts and elevators to a magnet which removed the metal particles of iron before placing in storage bins. Shipments were made in paper-lined boxcars to various Hazel Atlas glass plants. The quarry, which is still visible today, was managed for many years by W. Jack Proctor, son-in-law of N.Q. Spear. The plant was purchased by PGS and was eventually closed in 1935. From what I can find, the railroad track in Great Kakapen actually came across Route 9 as you're coming out of Great Kakapen headed west and run up along Higgins Run. I could not find any information as to when it was removed, but certainly it was sometime after PGS purchased it, which would be about 1935. During its relative short operating life, the Hazel Atlas sand plant had a significant impact on the Great Kakapen community. Along with employing over 100 men, the company also built 12 houses for employees. Locally, that's referred to as Hazeltown. A community doctor was paid for by the company and employees. The plant added greatly to the prosperity of the area. A September 1917 article in the Pittsburgh Press indicated new construction in this plant would increase output to 10 rail cars per day, and that the total glass sand production in Morgan County was reported as 55 rail cars per day. According to another article in the Charleston Daily Mail, dated August 29, 1920, Hazel Atlas had plans to build a second sand plant that would have increased employment to 200. The same article did not give much credence, however, to reports that Hazel Atlas was planning construction of a glass container plant in Great Cacapen. And the reason given was the lack of natural gas. Berkeley plant, PGS Berkeley plant. From the early days when the silica sand was mined by workers using jackleg drills and sticks of dynamite to break the sandstone, the loading of ore into mule-pulled carts with picks and shovels, the mining transitioned to coyote tunnel blasting, steam shovels loading small locomotive-pulled cars that would be unloaded at the crusher tipple. I mentioned coyote tunnel blasting, and I thought that's probably an unfamiliar term with many of you, so I'll go into a little explanation of what that happens for a reason. Coyote tunnel blasting consisted of drilling a 5-foot diameter hole back into the face of the deposit, and then loading this tunnel with ANFO, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, and igniting it. Before igniting it, they would load it with bags of sand to what's called stemming it, to prevent the blast from coming out the entrance to the tunnel. The reason they used this for vertical deposits, it brought down a mass of sand without much exposure for the employees. So it was an effective method before we had large equipment to move the sandstone or break the sandstone in place. So it was used for many years, beginning back in the 1920s and moving forward. However, it was discontinued in 1975, and some of you may remember an unidentified clay seam in one of those deposits as you're coming towards Berkeley had a clay seam in it, and the energy from the explosion prematurely released through that crack and actually threw some stones into the Jimstown area. No one was injured, thank God, but there was damage to numerous houses. After that point in time, this company moved from using that type of method to what they call vertical drilling, and they use a 6-inch or a 4-inch diameter drill that they drill down 25 or 30 feet, use a smaller amount of explosive, and therefore reduces the damage or the possibility of something like that happening again. In the 1960s, the locomotives were replaced with 20-ton electric wheel-driven trucks and large loaders. This permitted mining from multiple locations at greater distances at a higher efficiency rate. Similar equipment is still used today. The mining process was changed. The plant and processing equipment also involved. Wooden buildings were replaced with steel, concrete, and brick face ones. Primary and secondary crushers were consolidated and enlarged. Beginning in 1929, a new drain room and wet sand storage building was constructed and completed, and followed by the construction of a reduction building housing the Chilean mills for secondary crushing and rate classifiers to wash the sand. Construction also included a building to house the milling process and the air classification processes used to produce finely ground silica for scouring powders, paint, ceramics, and other uses. A separate sand processing system was built in a matter of days during World War II to supply a special sand needed by the military for airplane castings. Equipment to clean and recycle process water was installed along with modern dust collection equipment. These and other changes resulted in the Berkeley plant becoming the most modern silica sand processing in the industry at that time. Construction continued through the years with installation of a rod mill that eventually replaced all of the chaser mills. Rate classifiers were replaced with modern hydrocisers, and a coal-fired steam dryer was replaced with a fluid solids dryer. The original processing plant was expanded over time, increasing the initial reported capacity of 180 tons per day to nearly that amount on an hourly basis. During the 1970s, the plant mined and processed over 1 million tons per year. Due to changing market conditions, The yearly output today is reportedly as low as 1/3 that amount. With the years of modernization and capacity increases also came automation, job combinations, and workforce reductions. This and other factors would ultimately lead to the hourly workforce voted to be represented by the United Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1967. This was not the first attempt at unionizing the plant. In 1953, the Federated Glass, Ceramic, and Silica Workers of America called for a work stoppage, but 90% of the employees reported for work anyway. In 1967, however, the agreement with the Teamsters ended with a 3-year lockout of 38 men and ongoing picketing. A federal court trial eventually settled the strike, and the company was ordered to reinstate the men. The hourly workforce, which at that time exceeded 225 people, is now around 55. That strike caused a lot of animosity within the plant. And those that worked there for years and years, most of them have retired now, but there was a lot of animosity for those that came to replace the 38 workers when they came back. There was a lot of upset people in the process, you might say. It lasted for years. It didn't go away right away. But I'm sure that most of that now is gone because those have retired. Many residents refer to the local operation as a sand mine, but in reality, the facility has grown to be a complex mineral processing facility, producing a wide range of products used in glass for autos and buildings, glass for containers, fiberglass insulation, fiberglass reinforcements, fiberglass yarn, specialty glass, foundry sands, ceramics, chemicals, industrial sand as fillers and paints, silicone rubbers, filtration, water filtration primarily, recreational and agricultural uses, and occasionally frac sand. The Berkeley plant has been mining the Oriskany sandstone for nearly 120 years, and although no public records are available, it is estimated that over 70 million tons have been mined from Warm Springs Ridge. Recently, US Silica increased the mine permit limits closer to Berkeley Springs to extend mineable sandstone for an estimated additional 10 years. Although US Silica does own significant sandstone reserves across the Potomac River, it is not clear when or if that will be used to supply plant in the future. Along with providing jobs for several generations of local families, the Berkeley plant also added to the local economy with purchases of local hardware and automotive stores, excavating, mechanical and electrical contractors, and other service providers. Substantial donations were made to the local hospital, fire department, school athletic facilities, library, and other community improvement efforts. It was also largely responsible for the sustaining of the T.H. Compton Trucking Company, which hauled sand to customers and returned with coal used by the plant in its steam dryers and for heating local schools, hospital, and private residences. T.H. Compton was a 3-generation company that employed over 100 drivers at its peak, but ceased operation in 1996. Talk a little bit about Pennsylvania glass history. It started in Lewistown about 1894, became incorporated in 1902. The founders was Samuel J. Woods. And once they were incorporated, they began building and acquiring additional glass sand producing plants. Around 1927, the PGS company was merged with the newly formed Pennsylvania Glass Sand Corporation, headed by William J. Woods, a nephew of the original founder. This newly formed corporation acquired all of the sand producing facilities in Morgan County, West Virginia, as well as the Round Top Glass Sand Company and the Maryland Glass Sand Company in Hancock, Maryland. Reportedly, production of silica from all these plants totaled over 1.1 million tons in 1926, of which PGS plants accounted for over 60%. In 1929, Earl T. Andrews, a young civil engineer from McVeigh-town, Pennsylvania, was assigned responsibility for the design and construction oversight of the Berkeley Springs plant and the consolidation, demolition of the small plants located in the area. At that time, the engineering and operations offices were in Mapleton Depot, Pennsylvania, but with another expansion to Berkeley plant in 1946 through 48, the north office, now the plant office building, was constructed. The engineering and corporate offices function was relocated to Berkeley Springs. E.T., as he was often referred to, had a love of flying and became involved with the local Civil Air Patrol during World War II. That led to the construction of the Potomac Airport Park, which became a public airstrip in December of 1947. The runway was later asphalted and extended to nearly 5,000 feet by PGS to accommodate their corporate jet aircraft. Andrews became Vice President of Operations and Engineering in 1950, and in 1963, following the retirement of W.J. Woods, became the President of PGS. PGS Executive and General Office were moved from Lewistown to the North Office at Berkeley Springs in 1966. A short time later, the construction of the modern brick building south of the plant was completed and served as the headquarters of PGS until the corporate office was moved to Frederick, Maryland in 2011. That executive office now houses the Morgan County Senior Center and other community service groups. In 1946, E.T. Andrews made his home in Berkeley Springs and remained there for the rest of his life. His 3 adult children and their families also remained in Morgan County. PGS's presence and economic cultural impact continued to grow as various disciplines of engineers, research chemists, geologists, accountants, managers, and their support staff were employed at the corporate office, with many of their families living in Morgan County. Several housing developments were created or were dominated by PGS employees, i.e. Shirley Farms, Grove Heights, Brochers Hill, to name a few. These employees were actively involved in the community, taking leadership role in civic organizations, hospitals, school boards, and various other community support groups. And like E.T., after his retirements, several served in local government capacities. In 1968, with the urging of the board of directors, E.T. accepted an offer from ITT, a New York-based conglomerate, to purchase PGS. With the change in ownership, Hale Andrews, E.T.'s son, became president and CEO, while E.T. became chairman of the board, where he served until he retired in 1975. Leading up to this time, W.J. Woods Jr., son of William J., served as vice president of sales and marketing, with offices in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. With the purchase by IT&T, he left the company, and after a period of time, formed another glass sand company, Unisil, which ultimately became Unimin, PGS's largest employer, or largest competitor. Under the leadership of the Andrews family, the community continued to expand its silica sand operations. The sales and marketing offices in Pittsburgh were closed and those employees relocated to Morgan County. In 1966, PGS had annual sales of about $25.7 million, which by 1984 had increased to $84 million. RTZ Borax purchased PGS in 1985 for a reported $80 million. At the same time, Borax purchased Ottawa Silica and combined the two companies to form US Silica Company. In 1985, Hale Andrews retired and Richard E. Goodell became president. After the challenges of combining the two companies were completed, US Silica began moving many of the previously centralized functions, accounting, engineering, quality control, and customer service, from the executive office to each major plant. This greatly improved the individual plant's resources and performance, but it significantly reduced the staffing locally. In 1985, the US Silica was purchased by D. George Harris and Associates, a company specializing in leveraged buyouts, for a reported $120 million. Harris also purchased Better Materials, a Pennsylvania-based limestone producer, and for a period of time, both companies operated under the name Better Materials and Aggregates Company, BMAC. Local highway signage was changed to reflect that name. In 1999, Richard Shearer was named president, followed by John Ulizio in 2003. Harvest Partners, a private equity firm, purchased US Silica in August of 2007 and sold it to Golden Gate Capital in October of the same year for a reported $337 million. What's the reason for all that? What was happening there was the advent of fracturing and the use of fracturing sand and the demand for fracturing sand. The glass industry had for a long time been what we call a mature market. The frac sand came along and there was what they thought was an unrelenting demand for that sand. Plus that, the pricing was about double what they were getting for a glass sand. So it was only logical that that was going to happen, that they would start following it. So the investors started seeing big dollars and they very quickly bought US Silica up. With its executive offices in Frederick, Maryland, management made an initial public offering of the company in 2012, and its stock is now traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The executive offices have since been moved to Katy, Texas, with Brian Shin as president. US Silica during the last 10 to 15 years actively pursued a growing fracturing sand market used for horizontal drilling of oil and gas wells. The company has invested heavily in frac sand production facilities as well as the products for the oil and gas industry. In doing this, I ran across a couple of names that I had never really heard about or appreciated. Certainly, I want to recognize what I call some pioneers and families of the silica sand mining business in Morgan County. H.H. Hunter, Henry Harrison Hunter, had the initiative to get a sample, hand process it, as I understand, in these garage or basement or whatever, and then get it delivered to Chicago and entered the net. We all know the story from that. The Bridges family. Robert Bridges was a successful cement producer near Hancock, Maryland. And I never knew this, but at one point in time there was tunnels back under Round Top Mountain in Hancock. Cement was mined there, brought out, and actually dried in kilns there, loaded in 55-gallon barrels, transported across the river by a cable system, and loaded on the B&O Railroad. Well, he started the Berkeley Springs glass sand plant. After his passing, his son, Henry P. Bridges, took it over and ran it, as I mentioned, for several years. He was also a director at PGS for many years after the consolidation of the small plants here. But that wasn't his real passion. Henry P. Bridges' passion was the Woodmont Rod and Gun Club and preservation of the eastern wild turkey. Now, I don't want to just not recognize the Woods family because they were the ones that started the original PGS and came down and consolidated that, but they really weren't so much an impact in Morgan County as it was the PGS Corporation as a whole. But I do want to mention that Samuel Woods and his nephew, William J. The Andrews family. E.T. Andrews and his son guided PGS for two decades, really. But also, many people don't know, his other son, Fred, worked there, as did his son-in-law, Ed Middlecoff, and grandson, Earl and Doug. Currently, Doug still works there. And his son, Chase, is now the plant manager at the Berkeley Springs plant. One of the quarries at Pennsylvania Glass Sand, or US Silica, is called the Spear White. I always assumed it was the name of the owner, Spear and White. I never heard the name Noah Q. Spear before I started this research project. And the more I got into it, the more I was fascinated by the man. He was born in 1837 in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. His father was a successful shipbuilder and farmer. He also had a small sand plant. And once Noah graduated from Washington College, he became the manager of that. This Spear White Sand Company, you might recognize that name before, operated in Pennsylvania. Once he had depleted the reserves, he came to Hancock, West Virginia, and built the Hancock Glass Sand Company. So that was his first entrance into Morgan County. And then you heard me say he also built the Spear White Sand Company near Berkeley Springs, and also then went over to Great Capon and started the Hazel Atlas Glass Sand Company. Well, that's not all he did. He was up in Mapleton Depot, Pennsylvania, with the Empire Sand Company and the Juniata Sand Company, which are now part of US Silica at their Mapleton plant in Pennsylvania. He wasn't done then. He also applied for a patent in 1901 for the steam dryer that's used and still exists down at US Silica, and you've heard me mention it at several other locations here in the county. He also invented the screw classifier, log washer, as it was called. Crude as it was, made out of wood, but it was the forerunner of what we use today in the mining industry. After his retirement, Noah Spear identified a sand deposit in a place called Goshen, Virginia, and was in the process of getting permits and the land rights or the mining rights for that plant. His plan was to make another glass sand plant and start shipping it on the C&O Canal or C&O Railroad. He started ordering parts in 1922, but got ill shortly thereafter, and unfortunately passed away in 1930 at the young age of 93. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the hourly employees and the generations of employees that's worked at US Silica. It's not just a number of people, but it's multiple generations of families that have worked there. As growing up, I remember people saying, the sand mine is a family-run business. You got to know somebody to get on down there. And I suspect there's some truth in that statement. But it was not just the Andrews family, it was multiple families here in the county. Their father, their grandfather, brothers, sisters, everything else. So as we go through this, I thought I'd show some pictures of the generations of miners that worked down there. Names like Bratton, Daly, Fleece, Fox, McCumbee, Miller, Murray, Perry, Shade, Silver, Steiner, Stotler, Summers, Winsner, Wood, and oh so many more that I can't even begin to manage the name. I'd like to thank Earl Andrews, David P. Bridges, Tommy Miller, Gene Mosier, David Perry, Dick Rohn, and Gene Sprigg for helping with pictures and comments and information. And with that, thank you.